Hi, everybody. Welcome back from the break. That was such a great panel. And as you could tell, like David said, we would have needed so much more time, but it was good to get a flavor of it and to just engage with these three amazing speakers. I'm so thankful that Bishop Deon Johnson has agreed to speak with us. Um, I want to introduce him to you, and then I also want to welcome Bishop Mark to say a couple of words as well. I was actually Googling one day on racism, and I stumbled across a covenant and realized that it was written by Bishop Deon Johnson. I shared that with our task force, and we liked what we saw. And so David Case took the task on of really working on the covenant at the permission of Bishop Deon to taper it for our perspective. And that is the covenant that we shared with you earlier. So Bishop Deon is originally from the Caribbean island of Barbados, and we welcome you with us here at the convention of our convocation. In the weeks following the killing of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis, Bishop Johnson participated in nonviolent protest in the St. Louis region. And days after the clearing of nonviolent protesters at St. John's Church in Washington, D.C., Bishop Deon spoke at a solidarity rally at St. John's Episcopal Church in St. Louis's Tower Grove neighborhood. And he said, fear would tell us that dignity belongs to some and not to others. As followers of Jesus, we must live and know that perfect love casts out fear. We must, in the words of the prophet Micah, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Bishop, we're so glad that you're here. And I'd like to just pass it on to Bishop Eddington to welcome you as well.
Thank you, Stephen. I don't have a lot to add to that other than Deon. I'm so thankful for you spending your time with us today. I know you're a busy guy and you have a diocese of your own to manage, but thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And please teach us, speak to us. We're here.
Well, thank you, Mark. And can you all hear me okay? Awesome. Well, thank you. It's great to be with you all this morning for me, this almost evening for you. Um, I was saying to my spouse earlier, I get to travel all across Europe, and I didn't even have to get my passport out. But it's a joy to be with you this afternoon for you. Um, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. As you mentioned, the Anti-Racism Covenant came about because of the issues that were happening here um, following the death of George Floyd. And I know that his death had a ripple effect across the world. We began to see protests about racial discrimination and prejudice across the world, including in much of Europe. A little background about me. I am originally from Barbados, and Barbados was one of many British colonies. So I grew up with a population that looked primarily like me. So racism was not something that we talked too much about, and it wasn't until I really came to the United States that that became an issue. But for us here in the church, I often found that whenever we had these moments of racial reconciliation or racial uprising, the church would do what the church did best. We would issue a statement, we would say really good things about what's supposed to happen, and then we would move on to what came next. And I wasn't content with us just saying things and not moving further forward. And so I'd like to share my screen to oh, wrong one. Let me get the right one. To share a prayer that has spoken, well, for me, really speaks to our current moment. And so I invite you into a moment of prayer before we dive into a deeper conversation. Lord, help me wallow in my discomfort, stew in my unease, sit in my disquiet as we journey through this racialized pandemic. seeing clear inequities, anger, hurt. Aid us in our focus. Help us go to the margins, especially those at our own institutions. Let us stand with the lonely, the sick, the persecuted, those who have been violated. Let us sit with them in our own unease. Lord, help us to wallow in our discomfort. Let us lean in. Amen. That prayer was written by a student at a Catholic university here in the United States. And I think it captures our current moment. We don't do too well with discomfort. In the church, we kind of like things to be nice and comfortable and smooth. We don't want too many waves. And this current moment, I think, calls us to not to stand on the sidelines, but to dive deeply into the midst of what's going on in our world and in the countries across the world. And I often begin this type of conversation by saying we have to be able to see. And to see doesn't mean just kind of seeing what's in front of you. I often have been using the image of Jesus healing Bartimaeus. And here's a reading from the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his followers came into Jericho. As Jesus was leaving Jericho, together with his disciples and a sizable crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, Timaeus' son, was sitting beside the road. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was there, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, show me mercy." Many scolded him, telling him to be quiet, but he shouted even louder, "Son of David, show me mercy." Jesus shouted and stopped and said, "Call him forward." They called the blind man. "Be encouraged, get up. He's calling you." Throwing his coat to the side, he jumped up and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "Teacher, I want to see." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." At once he was able to see and he began to follow Jesus on the way. So, what does that have to do with racism and an anti racism covenant? Well, I am glad that you asked. The thing about this gospel is we often focus on Bartimaeus, and his name is Bar Timaeus, son of Timaeus. So he's actually never named. We assume that his name is Bartimaeus, but he is unnamed. And we're in Jericho. So Jericho is where the 1% go to have their country homes. It is the rich neighborhood. And so Jesus and his disciples are walking through this place that is just opulent. And a beggar is sitting on the corner begging for like begging to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be given some kind of dignity. And the crowd doesn't see him. And so he yells, and he heard about this Jesus, so he yells out to Jesus, and Jesus answers him. And I think Jesus asked perhaps one of the dumbest questions in the gospel of a blind man. "What do you want?" Well, I was hoping to go dancing this afternoon. Jesus says, so Bartimaeus says to Jesus, "I want to see." And Jesus says, "Well, your faith has healed you." And what does Bartimaeus do? Bartimaeus doesn't go and form the formerly blind society of Jericho. He doesn't create a theology commission on what to do. He follows. But the thing about this gospel is that Bartimaeus is not the only person that was healed. Bartimaeus was not the only person that was given his sight. The crowd was given his sight, their sight. Those people who were standing around, the people in Jericho who could not see Bartimaeus before, suddenly had their eyes opened to recognize that Bartimaeus was there. Racism does the same thing. We can easily be a part of that crowd that tries not to see it. As I said, I grew up in Barbados, and in Barbados, we didn't talk too much about racism. We were all West Indian or we were Bayesian. The elephant in the room was classism. We never talked about what it meant that some people were upper class and the divide between the classes. We never talked about the fact that if you were light skinned, you got a better job, and if you were dark skinned, you didn't. We never talked about what it meant to have good hair. And so, we as people of the African diaspora had internalized some of the racism that had been imported to us, where these were things that we were not able to talk about. And the sin of racism is insidious enough that it gets into every aspect of our common life. Um, the challenge for us, and the challenge for us as the people of faith, is to have our eyes opened that we can actually see the sin of racism around us. And we reinforce that often in the stories that we tell in church and the stories that we tell each other when we gather. I'm on the task force for the prayer book and liturgical renewal. And one of the places that we're doing a lot of work on is what it means that we, as followers of Jesus, always glorifies or lifts up whiteness. And it's crept into something as simple as how we read the Bible. So, for instance, we tend to associate everything white or light with being positive, and everything black and dark with being negative. A couple weeks ago in the RCL lectionary, we got the story of Moses interacting with God. And the story stops short of the next really important line where God is dwelling in deep darkness. In our lectionary, we don't hear those stories of where God is dwelling in the darkness. Um, think of all the foundational stories of our faith. The Genesis story, in the beginning, we hear and we latch onto God saying, "Let there be light." But where was God dwelling before God said, "Let there be light"? In the darkness. We hear of the seminal story of Christianity, the resurrection, and every resurrection account begins early in the morning while it was still dark. The resurrection takes place in the dark. And so God seems to dwell in the dark, but in the church, we don't often get to hear and see or spend time in those stories because, in many ways, we have associated Christianity with, for better or for worse, with a white God that's up on a cloud with a beard. And it means that we reinforce those stories as we go along. So, how do we, as the church in this time and place, with racial protests happening across the world, how do we address and respond to what's happening around us? Well, I think the way that we begin to respond by that is inviting ourselves to see. To see means that we must open our eyes, but it also means that we must open our hearts. The anti-racism covenant invites us to even just look to see who is on the altar on a Sunday morning as we gather for worship. How are we reflecting that diversity of beloved community that God calls us into, that we say a lot about, but often we don't have to think about it? On any given Sunday, if I'm sitting in the pew looking up, do I see myself reflected in those who are leading worship, even tangentially? Um, do I see myself in the decision makers for our church, for our diocese? Are we able to see that there is something wrong if everybody is the same? I mean, God builds us and creates us for intimacy with each other and for diversity of purpose. And so, if our liturgy, our worship, our gatherings, our leadership aren't reflecting the diversity that is around us, we are back to being part of that blind crowd that can't see Bartimaeus, that all we can do is cry out to Jesus. And so the invitation in this anti-racism covenant isn't to beat up on white Europeans. It's not to beat up on anybody. Because if you listen to the healing of Bartimaeus, it's not just Bartimaeus, it's the crowd. Everybody is healed. And so when we actually begin to live into these ideals of diversity and inclusion and seeing discrimination as something that we oppose, and when we start living into being anti-racist, everyone is healed. Um, Here in the United States, and I know that it's spread across to Europe as well, the Black Lives Matter movement has gained lots of steam. And the thing is, the counter response, and I've heard it more than once, is that all lives matter. But to assert that one set of lives matters does not decry that the other lives don't matter. What I've said is that if your house is on fire and you call the fire department and the fire dispatcher says to you, well, all houses in the neighborhood matter, it doesn't stop your house from being being burnt down. To assert that we need to be anti-racist, that we must be able to see the places and name those places where we have fallen short. For me, the reason why this covenant has a lament and then the covenant is because we have to be able to name things. Until we are able to fully and accurately name what is actually happening, we are doomed to continue the patterns that we have seen before. Until we can name those places where others have been hurt, when we can name those places that people have been discriminated against because of their ethnic background, because of their race, because of the language that they speak, because of their accent, until we can fully name those, we are trapped in a place where we are simply glossing over the chaos that lies underneath. In the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, there was this wonderful line that the priest would say to the family just before baptism. The priest would say to the family and to the godparents, name this child. And that naming was a way for us to recognize what God had already done. It was a naming that said to that child, you are beloved, you are known, you are seen, you are a picture on God's refrigerator. It was a way of God claiming that child. And in claiming it and naming that child, it meant that that child was beloved. It meant that that child was redeemed by Jesus Christ's action here on earth. We are called to do the exact same thing. The naming is not a naming to blame, it is a naming to claim. We have to be able to claim these places where racism has fractured the community. We need to be able to name those places where racism has broken relationships. We need to name those places where racism has caused hurt and pain systematically and in many places generationally, primarily against people of color. The church, I think, is uniquely positioned in a place to begin that message of reconciliation. Reconciliation calls us to first say what it is that we're reconciling, and then begin to heal towards forgiveness and being that beloved community that we're called into. So the two things that I would leave you with, and I think we have some time for questions, would be that we are called first to see and then to name. The seeing gives us the eyes to be able to look with the eye of the heart, and the naming gives us the opportunity to call out those places where we have fallen short so that we can begin that invaluable work of reconciling one to another. And so I will stop talking, and I think that there's an opportunity for questions and answers, and I will happily begin to try to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Bishop Deon. Thank you so much for what you have shared with us. I want to encourage everyone to use the chat mechanism again at the bottom of your screens to ask questions of Bishop Deon, and then we can pass them on to him. I want to start while giving others a chance to post their questions. So how did you use the covenant in your diocese? So we have this, we're going to be submitting it for a vote. I'm sorry, I was just reminded that to ask you to use the question and answer box, not the chat box, for your questions. How did you use it? How did you implement that covenant within the diocese?
So we offered it to everyone across the diocese, to sign on. There's a website that is dedicated to it's antiracismcovenant.com or .org, or it's one of them. But we encourage the folks in the diocese to sign on to it. And this diocese, we have a Dismantling Racism Commission. And so the Dismantling Racism Commission is in the process of actually putting together a 12-part curriculum that can be used in individual congregations or with groups. And so that's been a part of it. We've also had some pretty hard conversations in the diocese using the covenant as a springboard for those conversations. And so hopefully once the curriculum is actually completed, it'll live under the resource section of the Covenant website.
So did you call meetings in the diocese to speak specifically and to walk through the covenant with people, or how did you do that?
We had several speakers coming to talk about the sin of racism. So Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas was one of our speakers, among others. And so we invited folks to those as a way to just begin the conversation. And the covenant became the basis of those type of conversations across the diocese. So, but what I've said is, this is a covenant that we offered from the diocese to the whole church, and there's no one way to interact with it. I love the fact that your diocese was able to adjust it to fit your context, because that's my hope. That we can adapt this based on where we are, rather than it being a one-size-fits-all type thing.
Thank you. Other questions from those of you who are on the call or task force members?
Wow, I was that clear. Okay, I'll take it.
Okay, here's one. Let me see. So Allison Gray is asking, Bishop Deon, where do we start?
Well, that's always a challenging question. I mean, here's the thing. Most of the time, we see racism as the big splashy things. George Floyd being killed on national TV. Here in the United States, white supremacists walking around with tiki torches. And we look at that type of stuff, protests in the streets, and we go, well, what do we do? The interesting thing for people of color, racism isn't often those big events. For most people of color, it's the micro racisms that you face every day. It's the person who comes and follow you in the department store. It's those little things, the micro racisms of every day. And the thing is, as a person of color, eventually you get so tired of it that you almost just expect it. And for people who are not of color, so mainly for white people, the challenge is we need allies. The thing is, if I stand up and I am yelling, "Hey, Black Lives Matter," and I'm in danger, after a while, I get dismissed as the angry black man. It is in allies who can take up the cause and say, this is not right. We cannot continue to do worship, or we cannot continue to do the things that we do the way that we're doing it. It takes allies, but it also takes recognizing that racism is interconnected with so much of systems. It's how we treat women. It's how we treat people who are LGBTQ. It's how we treat people who are born in a foreign country. It's how we treat people who speak a different language. I mean, all of those things are interconnected.
So that was
Um,
another question. Sunny asked, how is the sin of racism different from other kinds of hatefulism? For example, oppression of LGBT people or women.
yeah. Well, racism is specific prejudice against people of color because of their skin color, and perceived attributes. And there's some attributes that are prejudiced against that are not inherently visible. So, for instance, you can be LGBTQ, and unless you say or express it, nobody knows that. I can't hide being brown. um, there was a great article a couple years ago here after the Charlottesville protests, where one of the guys in the Tiki Torches, he was interviewed by, I think, Rolling Stone magazine, and they asked him, well, why did you go to be a part of this? And he said, well, I just wanted to try it on to see what it felt like. And after the protest, he simply took off his polo shirt and he blended into the crowd as just another kid in the crowd. Um, the thing for people of color, I can't take off a shirt and suddenly blend back into the crowd. So racism targets specifically your skin tone, and um, it becomes a systematic thing rather than something that is just, I mean, when you think of the systems that have been put in place to ensure that people of color generally are not given opportunities to move ahead, discrimination in housing, discrimination by, more frequent stops by law enforcement. I mean, the list is long.
So another person on the call asked, Felicity wanted to know, how has this, and I'm thinking she's meaning the covenant,
Mhm.
changed the people in your diocese?
Well, I think for one thing, it's made us a lot more aware of how we do what we do. The diocesan events, and mind you, I've only been the bishop here for about 4 months, so there's not been a whole lot of time and we're in the middle of a pandemic, so there's not been a whole lot of time to fully engage as we would. But even just in the short time that I've been here, we have made some strides with our Dismantling Racism Commission. It, in working with the Covenant, our diocesan convention is coming up near the end of November, and there are two-hour workshops that are being put on by our Dismantling Racism Commission on the Covenant. Um, we have had some, as I mentioned, some really hard conversations about race in this diocese. And the intention is, starting in 2021, each month we're going to have some kind of conversation or engagement around race and racism, to ensure that this isn't just okay, we've done our covenant, we've done our little piece, and okay, let's move on to what's next. The intention is that we're going to continue to lean into this. I mean,
I
it
mean,
took us.
the covenant is so dense that it's almost like you could spend a whole lifetime implementing that covenant.
That is kind of what the hope is, that you do spend a decent amount of time um, figuring out how we do this. And the covenant pieces, I think, invites us into some actionable things. You don't have to take up the entire covenant. I mean, God bless you if you can. But to say, okay, this part of the covenant is something that I can do to begin to recognize my privilege or lack of privilege, and begin to change something. It's not a okay, we do these 12 things and we're done. It is a continuous process of going back and asking, okay, how can I continue to push this further forward into that beloved community that we're called into?
So Alex says that he served 25 years in the US Army. And he says, there I had Black superiors and subordinates. I think this led me to know, all capital, and respect Black people. How do we duplicate this experience with programs in the church or elsewhere?
Well, I think what we do is we are intentional about inviting people of color into spaces of leadership. It is great to say that everybody has had some kind of anti-racism training and all that stuff in the church, but until we are willing to invite folks into the or into places of leadership, into places where their voices are heard and amplified, we're just spinning our wheels. I mean, we have to have people of color, the underrepresented people, as part of the decision making. That folks can see that there are people who look like them in those places. And it means that our leadership has to be able to invite folks into the conversation. I mean, for me, being a bishop, I know that if when I enter a room or when I sit in a room in my diocese, suddenly everybody's going to stop and look to me to say something. And part of my privilege is to give away my privilege. I mean, the thing about privilege is neutral. It's how we use our privilege that's important. And so for me, I can give away my privilege and say, you know what, I don't need to be the voice that's speaking. I'm going to raise up a voice that's not often spoken, that doesn't often get to speak. So even something as simple as that in a meeting, if you recognize that there's only one person of color, don't expect that person to represent all people of color. Um, I mean, but also invite that person to take the lead sometimes in the conversation, knowing that they could say they have the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to take the lead, or I don't want to have to feel like I'm speaking for all people of color. But just having them having us people of color at the table is the first step, I think, in most of that.
I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you heard Brian Stevenson's interview with Oprah. Brian
I don't
Stevenson,
think I have.
attorney who fights for people who have been wrongfully convicted, most of the
Mm.
times people of color and who are on death
Mhm.
row. And he is the initiator of the Equal Justice Initiative,
Oh, yes.
the
Okay.
National Memorial,
Hmm.
which is absolutely stunning and powerful. But he
Yeah.
talks about the ideology of white supremacy, which was concocted
Mhm.
because otherwise, people who were Christians, there's no way that they could have lived with subjugating Black people unless they had an ideology that
Mhm.
gave them that permission, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you think that that ideology still exists within our church?
In many ways, yes. Like I said earlier in part of my introduction, even looking at the lectionary, um, we reinforce in how we choose to read the Bible some of those same ideologies. I mean, none of us would pick up Paul's letter to the Ephesians and justify slavery by saying, slaves obey your master in the Lord, for this is right. But, for most of slavery, that was used as a justification. It was interesting that during slavery, Paul's letters were used by those who were pro-slavery, and Jesus's words were used by those who were anti-slavery. Just something to think about. But the reality is we continue these ideologies even in the language that we use in church. We continue to say that one is better than the other. Um, Now imagine if instead of talking about light and darkness during Advent, we talked about the season of light and shadow. Shadow has a whole different connotation than darkness. Um, or if we eliminated that dichotomy altogether from Advent. Advent at its core is about hope, about God coming among us. And then, yes, we have the beautiful idea of the light shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. But if we continue to read that same passage, we find that the darkness is just as powerful and just as life-giving as the darkness.
Thank
So, I
you.
mean, I think we continue it.
Yeah. There's one last question that I want to ask you from the question and answer box from Peter. It's a follow-up to Alex's question. He said, perhaps this is something where virtual missions or virtual question mark could play a role, like living room conversations.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and this is my own theory. My theory is we would not be in this moment were it not for this pandemic. I firmly believe we would not be having this conversation about racial reconciliation or racialization if we weren't in this pandemic. Um, George Floyd's death would have just been another long list of another person of color being killed. We would have had protest in Minneapolis for a couple of weeks, and we would have moved on. If it weren't for this pandemic, if it weren't for the instant news, I don't think we would be having this conversation. I think we would have watched again. I mean, we saw it with Breonna Taylor. We saw it with Aubrey. We saw it with Philando Castile. Here in my own diocese, we saw it with Mike Brown. We had protests and we moved on. And then this pandemic happened, and we're all at home, and we're all able to see and encounter this stuff. And suddenly it's like, oh my goodness, the pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color. Why is that? We see George Floyd being lynched on national TV for 8 and some odd minutes, and suddenly people are like, "Well, wait a minute. We, I'm at home. I can go to the streets and protest. I can demand that." I mean, think about this. If you had said here in the United States that Confederate monuments across the South were going to be toppled a year ago, we'd been talking about it for what, decades, and nothing happened. If you had said that that was going to happen, I mean, even in London, where the statue of a prominent slave trader had been sitting there and people had been talking about removing it for years and they finally got rid of it. If we weren't in this current moment, I honestly do not think that we would have been reckoning with our own racial histories.
Yeah, yeah. One last, it's actually a statement kind of framed as a question, but I'm just going to read it and then we're going to wrap up this session. Father Thomas Myers says, not only invite people of color to positions of leadership, but also invite them into our homes and our personal spheres.
Yes. Well, it's, people, some of our sisters and brothers who are European and European descent will, and here in the United States, we hear it all the time. Well, I have a black friend. Well, hallelujah and amen. When was the last time that black friend came over for dinner? When was the last time that black friend and that black friend's kids interacted with your kids? Until we are intentional to make those relationships, it is simply superficial. So yeah, until you, I mean, and don't go out and make a black friend just because the Bishop of Missouri said you should go make a black friend. Um, we find that we have so much more in common when we break bread together. Build on the relationships that you already have. Be intentional that, if I'm in a sphere and everybody looks like me, maybe there's something wrong with that. Now, don't get me wrong, we all need to be in those places of people that are like us and like-minded, because I mean, I like to be around some of my Caribbean sisters and brothers, because you need that, common ancestry and all that stuff. But if you are able to go through life and the sphere of people that are part of your sphere all look like you all the time, maybe it's time to rethink.
Thank you so much, Bishop Deon. Thank you for writing down your thoughts into a covenant, and thank you for allowing us to take that and to modify it for our situation here. We so
Awesome.
appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to spend this time sharing your heart and your mind with us, as well as taking questions.
Awesome.
So
Well, thank you. I
God
usually
bless you.
say to my clergy when we're ending these things, be well, stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask, pray, and pray often.
Thank you.